59 years later, I am an old man sitting at a computer monitor as worn and dated as me. I'm typing this story perhaps to distract myself from the terror, to stop myself peering out of the window of my isolated log cabin, to not stare death himself in the eyes. He is not a black-robed reaper with a scythe, but a living creature that has suctioned its haunting mass to the glass pane. A whitish-gray organoid with black spheres jutting from its pulpy and bloated brain matter. Yes, a brain. A farcical abomination has come to kill me, and I don't blame it. I am the last of the mad scientists who birthed its kind. He has slithered 100 yards through the snow on this fraught and frigid evening, moving like a slug through the snow, and now he's watching me from the black of night and white of snowfall. I've imagined my death in many ways for many years. I always thought my former employer would be the one to put me out of my misery, but I suppose my end will be quicker this way. I hope the brain meets an end too, for your sake, for humanity's sake. Though I am ready for life to end at a ripe 82 years of age, this old man is still unthinkably afraid. You don't age out of existential dread. I mean, if you were only looking at the thing on the other side of my window, you'd be terrified too. I must share my story so this never happens again. You may have seen articles in recent years about scientists turning stem cells into organic neural tissue with optic cups, which are eye-like formations. These mini brains do not yet mimic a true brain's cerebral complicacy, thankfully. Dozen-minus already achieved that decades ago, and it ended terribly. These men lack ethics, running about unchecked and undocumented, unless one counts fellow whistleblowers, and they, much like those who leave the company, never survive. There is no leaving dozen-minus, not with all we know. That is why I have been hiding from them since 1980, when the Brain Organoid project went awry. My story begins in 1967. I was part of Dr. Harrow's project to research the inner workings of human consciousness and thus code digital brains for living computers. That year, we successfully grew neural tissue from pluripotent stem cells. We housed them within a large lidded container of liquid culture medium, serving as more of a petri box than a mere dish. This cell culture box was contained in a large incubator to maintain the correct temperature and oxygenated environment for the organoids to thrive. But our Frankensteinian experiment had unintentional results. Each of the 11 mini organoids formed optic cups, which are the antecedents to retinas. These minuscule eye-like formations sprouted from their neural tissue bodies. The brains grew eyes. To say we were horrified would be an understatement. We were naive to horror at that time. We didn't know how bad things could be. Dr. Harrow fitted a magnified glass front to the incubator so we could better discern the 3-millimeter wide cerebral organoids with the naked eye. We were flabbergasted to see the underwater brains swimming about in that titanic vat of liquid nutrient medium. They looked like minuscule aquatic creatures, plump and stout tadpoles, perhaps. Much like tadpoles, in fact, these creatures were in their larval stage, for they were evolving so far beyond their intended purpose and design. They were moving not only their bodies, but their black optic cups too, And after a short while of observing the creatures flexing their unnerving little eye formations at one another, Dr. Grayson came up with a horrible hypothesis. They're communicating with one another. Dr. Harrow's eyes widened. Heavens, Grayson, I think you might be right. The difference was that he and the other scientists seemed excited, whereas Grayson looked just as terrified as me. If the brains were communicating, that meant they were sentient. We hadn't signed up to create sentient life, but I knew that was an ethical can of worms we would never close. It was done. The question was, what comes next? Nothing good, I told myself. Their sign language was expressed by reshaping their black optic cups, expanding, contracting, elongating, and sometimes even retracting their eye-like formations into their mushy gray brain matter. I marveled at and feared those creatures in equal measure. I hated their movements, the uncanniness of their black eyes sprouting like tumors from their swimming clumps of brain tissue. Maybe the most terrifying thing was their awareness of us. They would often twist their floating forms in the liquid nutrient and gaze at us through 2 panes of glass, their petri container and the magnified window at the front of the incubator. They were watching us as much as we were watching them. I didn't like that. And on account of their black eyes, our team came to informally call the mysterious creatures optics. The higher-ups were happy enough with that term. Their rate of evolution scared me, but it thrilled Dr. Harrow. He used neuroimaging to analyze their brain patterns, starting to care more about understanding their consciousness than our own. My colleagues and I knew this was beyond the parameters of the initial experiment Dozen- had funded, but we must have been drunk on the power of having created life. Maybe I thought myself a god at first. We should pull the plug, Dr. Grayson whispered to me one evening. I turned to her with relief in my eyes, grateful for one other sane scientist. Nevertheless, my fear was outweighed by my intrigue. This is why I joined Dozen-, to go above and beyond the public realm of science. Science is scary, I reminded myself when I struggled to sleep at night. But the insomnia never did go away. As the years went by, it only worsened. After months of watching the optics communicate and evolve, we wanted to get in on the conversation. We would teach them our language, and they would teach us theirs. The optics spent some of their time staring at us. They seemed curious enough to connect. We brought in our organization's best linguists to interpret the optic language. The experts held up photographs of objects labeled in English writing, and the optics translated those words into their signed vernacular of complex eye signals. We steadily built the optic dictionary, and they seemed to be doing the same, mentally at least. Once we had mastered each other's basic lexicon, we covered connectives, prepositions, and grammar. Given their accelerated cognitive ability, we quickly moved on to British Sign Language, BSL, as the linguists explained the latter was far faster and more efficient form of communication without the spoken word at our disposal, for the creatures had no ears. Grayson and I learned BSL too, as we were desperate to communicate with ease rather than having to write down messages for the creatures. As we taught each other for years, the optics worked on their home in other ways. They started building. They shed their brain tissue regularly and used the matter to create structures, homes, schools, and community centers. It unsettled me, I think, because I recalled my sister teasing me as a child one Christmas. She put my gingerbread man in our gingerbread house and asked whether he was made of house or the house was made of him. That question kept running through my mind as I watched the optics build a neighborhood out of their own bodies. I was afraid of how little Dozen Minus understood about the physiology and psychology of these living things we'd created. We were stumbling and fumbling in the dark. Grayson was right. We should have pulled the plug. It took us all in all 5 years to wholly translate the optic language into English. By that summer of 1972, most of our team could fluently communicate with mini brains either in writing or BSL. The 11 optics had developed an egalitarian community, living in equality and harmony. There were no conflicts. There was no strife. After all, they were not hunter-gatherers. We, their gods, gave them all the resources they needed. They were carefree. They were happy. They worked together. That is what terrified me. They threatened to replace us as the dominant